Yet, Sterling's most audacious and dangerous move was yet to come. While the Senate debated, and the nation watched with bated breath, Sterling initiated a series of direct communications with loyalists within the national security apparatus, bypassing official channels entirely. He was attempting to mobilize private security forces, funded by his illicit gains, and to coordinate with rogue elements within the intelligence community who still harbored a fervent, almost cult-like devotion to him. His plan was audacious: to create a narrative of chaos and widespread dissent that would justify a unilateral declaration of martial law, suspending the impeachment proceedings and retaining power by force. He envisioned a scenario where the Senate, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, would be forced to cede authority to him, the sole protector of order. This final, desperate gambit was the culmination of his deeply ingrained narcissism and his inability to comprehend a world that did not revolve around his desires. He saw himself not as a president accountable to the law, but as a sovereign, entitled to absolute power. The whispers of military support, the flurry of pardons, the attempts to manufacture a crisis, these were not separate actions, but interconnected threads in a desperate tapestry woven to preserve his ego and his grasp on power. He genuinely believed that by sowing enough discord and chaos, he could force the nation to bend to his will, to accept him as an indispensable leader who was above the fray of petty legalities. As Elias Vance watched the news reports flicker on a monitor in a secure room near the Senate chamber, he felt a cold dread wash over him. The encrypted communications intercepted by his team, the frantic calls from compromised intelligence assets, all pointed to a coordinated effort to destabilize the country. Sterling was no longer playing by the rules of law or politics, he was attempting to incite a coup, however poorly conceived. The precariousness of democracy, Vance realized, was never more starkly illuminated than in these final moments, when a desperate autocrat, facing the loss of everything, was willing to gamble with the very fabric of the nation. The outcome of the Senate's vote was no longer just about impeachment, it was about whether the Republic could withstand the destructive fury of a man who refused to let go of the power he had so thoroughly corrupted. Sterling's final stand was not a valiant defense, but a frantic, dangerous lashing out, a primal scream against the inevitable judgment he so richly deserved. The nation held its breath, waiting to see if Sterling's desperate gambit would plunge it into an abyss, or if its democratic institutions, tested to their breaking point, would ultimately prevail. The pronouncements within the Senate chamber, however weighty, felt increasingly detached from the pulsating reality that had seized the nation. Sterling's final, desperate maneuvers, the pardons, the veiled threats to the military, the frantic whispers to compromised intelligence assets, had not merely been acts of political desperation, they had served as the catalyst for something far more profound. They had galvanized the people, transforming a simmering discontent into a roaring inferno of public demand for accountability. The abstract pronouncements of law and order, so meticulously debated by senators, were now dwarfed by the visceral, undeniable clamor of a citizenry awakened to the fragility of their democratic foundations. Across the country, the initial shock and disbelief that had accompanied the unfolding impeachment saga had long since given way to a potent, unifying anger. News channels, no longer solely focused on the procedural nuances of the Senate, found themselves broadcasting images of spontaneous gatherings in town squares, in front of state capitals, and on the steps of courthouses. These were not orchestrated rallies, but organic outpourings of collective conscience. Families, friends, and strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, holding signs that proclaimed simple yet powerful messages. Our vote matters, no one is above the law, democracy demands better. The air vibrated with a shared resolve, a quiet but unyielding insistence that the events of the past months were not merely a political drama to be observed, but a fundamental challenge to be met. The bedrock of this burgeoning movement lay in a profound reevaluation of the nation's values. For too long, the seductive allure of unchecked executive power, of strongman leadership, had been subtly normalized, often cloaked in the rhetoric of patriotism and national security. Sterling, in his egregious abuse of that power, had inadvertently stripped away the veneer, revealing the dangerous chasm that yawned between the ideal of a republic and the reality of its potential perversion. The conversations happening in living rooms, in online forums, and at impromptu neighborhood meetings were no longer about partisan loyalties or policy debates. They were about integrity, about the ethics of leadership, and about the very soul of the nation. A deep, unsettling question began to echo. Had the nation grown too complacent, too willing to overlook transgressions in the name of perceived strength or stability? This societal reckoning manifested in the emergence of a new breed of activism, one that bypassed traditional political structures and spoke directly to the heart of the matter. Grassroots organizations, many formed in the wake of Sterling's most brazen acts, began to proliferate. These were not monolithic entities, but a diverse tapestry of community groups, digital advocacy networks, and citizen watchdog initiatives. Their agendas were varied but unified by a common purpose: to ensure that the lessons learned from Sterling's presidency would not be forgotten. They focused on tangible reforms, pushing for greater transparency in government, stronger protections for whistleblowers, and more robust oversight mechanisms for executive power. They organized voter registration drives in underserved communities, conducted educational campaigns on civic responsibility, and held public forums where ordinary citizens could voice their concerns and demand accountability from their elected officials. One such movement, born from the ashes of a silenced investigation, focused on bolstering protections for investigative journalists and empowering citizens with reliable information. Its members, many of them young people who had grown up in the digital age, recognized the insidious threat posed by disinformation and the deliberate manipulation of truth. They developed online platforms that fact-checked political claims, created accessible guides to understanding complex legal and governmental processes, and championed the importance of a free and independent press. Their slogan, "Truth is our shield," became a rallying cry for those who understood that an informed populace was the ultimate defense against tyranny. Another significant wave of activism centered on the insidious role of money in politics. The pardons granted to Sterling's financiers, the shadowy campaign contributions that had fueled his rise, and the persistent allegations of quid pro quo arrangements all pointed to a system deeply susceptible to corruption. Citizen groups began demanding campaign finance reform, advocating for greater disclosure of political spending, and pushing for legislation that would limit the influence of wealthy donors and corporations on political decision-making. They organized peaceful protests outside the offices of powerful lobbying firms, staged mock, pay-to-play scenarios to highlight the absurdity of current regulations, and relentlessly petitioned their representatives for meaningful change. The sentiment was clear: the voice of the people should not be drowned out by the clink of gold. The cultural impact was equally profound. Artists, musicians, and writers, inspired by the collective will to reclaim their democracy, began to produce works that reflected the national mood. Plays were staged that explored themes of political corruption and civic duty. Documentaries were produced that delved into the history of democratic struggles and the importance of vigilance. Songs were written that spoke of hope, resilience, and the power of collective action. These creative expressions served as a vital form of catharsis and education, helping to process the trauma of the past years and to forge a shared vision for the future. They reminded people that democracy was not a passive inheritance but an ongoing project, requiring constant tending and active participation. Elias Vance, observing this societal metamorphosis from the periphery of power, understood that the legal verdict, whatever it might be, was only one part of the equation. Sterling's downfall, he recognized, was not merely the end of a presidency, but the beginning of a national conversation. The raw, unscripted passion of the people demanding justice was a testament to the enduring strength of democratic ideals. It was a powerful counterpoint to the cynicism and despair that Sterling's actions had sought to sow. He saw in the impassioned faces of protesters, in the earnest efforts of community organizers, and in the creative outpouring of artists, a potent reminder that true power ultimately resided not in the gilded halls of government, but in the collective will of an engaged citizenry. The whisper campaigns and desperate attempts by Sterling's allies to sow division and doubt, while potent in their initial impact, began to falter against the sheer weight of this unified public outcry. The pardons, intended to cripple the prosecution and protect the guilty, instead served as a stark illustration of the rot that had permeated the administration, further fueling the public's resolve. Each act of defiance from Sterling, each attempt to subvert the democratic process, only seemed to fan the flames of popular resistance. The people, having witnessed the extent of his corruption and his willingness to sacrifice the nation's integrity for personal gain, were no longer willing to be passive spectators. This collective awakening was not a fleeting moment of outrage but a deep-seated commitment to structural change. The movements that emerged were not content with simply removing Sterling, they were determined to build a more resilient and accountable system. They understood that the vulnerabilities exploited by Sterling were not unique to him but were systemic flaws that needed to be addressed with urgency and determination. The fight for justice had transcended the courtroom and the Senate chamber, becoming a fundamental quest to redefine the relationship between the governed and those who governed. The narrative of Sterling's reign had been one of ego, entitlement, and the erosion of democratic norms. But the narrative that was now unfolding, written by the people themselves, was one of awakening, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of a more just and equitable society. It was a testament to the fact that even in the face of profound corruption and the near collapse of institutions, the spirit of democracy, when truly tested, could emerge stronger, more vibrant, and more determined than ever before. The verdict of the people, in its most fundamental sense, was not a judgment on an individual, but a reaffirmation of their own power and their unyielding commitment to the ideals of a free and self-governing nation. The reckoning had begun, not just for Sterling, but for the nation itself, a reckoning that promised a painful but ultimately cathartic path toward renewal. The echoes of their voices, once scattered and unheard, were now a chorus, demanding not just the fall of a corrupt leader, but the rise of a renewed democracy. The air in the capital, once thick with the acrid fumes of political maneuvering and thinly veiled threats, began to clear. Not with the pristine clarity of a spring morning, but with the stark, unforgiving light of dawn that exposes every stain, every imperfection. Sterling's final, desperate acts, the last-minute pardons, the thinly disguised pressure on military brass, the clandestine communications with compromised intelligence assets, had not just been tactical gambits. They had been the final, convulsive spasms of a dying regime, inadvertently igniting a firestorm of public demand for accountability that no amount of executive fiat could extinguish. The Senate's pronouncements, the legalistic dance of impeachment, had become a distant echo, drowned out by the visceral roar of a populace awakened to the precariousness of their democratic foundations. The initial shock that had rippled through the nation had long since dissipated, replaced by a potent, unifying anger. News outlets, their cameras no longer exclusively trained on the procedural intricacies of the Senate, now broadcast the raw, unscripted scenes from town squares, state capitol steps, and courthouse plazas across the country. These were not rallies organized by seasoned strategists, but spontaneous outpourings of a collective conscience. Families, friends, strangers, they stood shoulder to shoulder, their signs bearing simple, resonant messages. Our vote matters, no one is above the law, democracy demands better. A shared resolve vibrated in the air, a quiet, unyielding insistence that the past months were not merely a political drama to be passively observed, but a fundamental challenge to be confronted head-on. This societal metamorphosis was rooted in a profound reevaluation of national values. The seductive allure of unchecked executive power, the appeal of a strongman leader, had been insidiously normalized, often masked by the grandiloquent rhetoric of patriotism and national security. Sterling, in his egregious abuse of that power, had inadvertently ripped away the veneer, exposing the dangerous chasm between the ideal of a republic and the terrifying reality of its potential perversion. Conversations, once confined to the partisan echo chambers of living rooms and online forums, now transcended political loyalties and policy debates. They delved into integrity, into the ethics of leadership, and into the very soul of the nation. A deep, unsettling question began to permeate the collective consciousness. Had the nation grown too complacent, too willing to overlook transgressions in the name of perceived strength or stability? This reckoning birthed a new wave of activism, one that bypassed the established political channels, speaking directly to the raw nerve of the nation's conscience. Grassroots organizations, many born from the crucible of Sterling's most audacious acts, proliferated like wildflowers after a wildfire. These were not monolithic entities, but a diverse mosaic of community groups, digital advocacy networks, and citizen watchdog initiatives, each with its own focus but united by a common purpose, to ensure that the lessons learned from Sterling's presidency would not be buried and forgotten. Their efforts were tangible, pushing for greater transparency in government, bolstering protections for whistleblowers, and advocating for more robust oversight mechanisms for executive power. They organized voter registration drives in underserved communities, launched educational campaigns on civic responsibility, and hosted public forums where ordinary citizens could voice their concerns and demand accountability from their elected officials. One particularly influential movement, forged in the aftermath of a silenced investigation, dedicated itself to bolstering protections for investigative journalists and empowering citizens with reliable information. Its members, many of them young people who had navigated the complexities of the digital age since childhood, understood the insidious threat posed by disinformation and the deliberate manipulation of truth. They developed sophisticated online platforms for fact-checking political claims, created accessible guides to deciphering complex legal and governmental processes, and championed the indispensable role of a free and independent press. Their slogan, "Truth is our shield," resonated deeply, becoming a rallying cry for those who recognized that an informed populace was the ultimate bulwark against tyranny. Another significant wave of activism directly confronted the corrosive influence of money in politics. The pardons granted to Sterling's major financial backers, the opaque nature of his campaign contributions, and the persistent allegations of quid pro quo arrangements all pointed to a system alarmingly susceptible to corruption. Citizen groups began a relentless campaign for campaign finance reform, demanding greater disclosure of political spending and advocating for legislation that would curb the undue influence of wealthy donors and corporations on political decision-making. They organized peaceful demonstrations outside the imposing headquarters of powerful lobbying firms, staged mock, pay-to-play scenarios to highlight the absurdities of current regulations, and petitioned their representatives with unwavering resolve for meaningful change. The message was unequivocal. The voice of the people should not be drowned out by the clinking of coins. The cultural impact of this awakening was equally profound. Artists, musicians, and writers, inspired by the collective will to reclaim their democracy, began producing works that captured and amplified the national mood. Plays emerged that explored themes of political corruption and the moral imperative of civic duty. Documentaries delved into the historical struggles for democracy and the enduring importance of vigilance. Songs were composed that spoke of hope, resilience, and the transformative power of collective action. These creative expressions served as a vital form of catharsis and education, helping the nation process the trauma of the preceding years and forge a shared vision for the future. They served as a potent reminder that democracy was not a passive inheritance but an ongoing project, demanding constant tending and active participation. Elias Vance, observing this societal metamorphosis from the periphery of power, understood that the legal verdict, whatever its eventual form, was only one facet of a far larger reckoning. Sterling's downfall, he recognized, was not merely the end of a presidency, it was the commencement of a national conversation. The raw, unscripted passion of a people demanding justice was a testament to the enduring strength of democratic ideals, a powerful counterpoint to the cynicism and despair Sterling's actions had sought to sow. He saw in the impassioned faces of protesters, in the earnest dedication of community organizers, and in the creative outpouring of artists, a potent reminder that true power ultimately resided not in the gilded halls of government, but in the collective will of an engaged citizenry. The whisper campaigns and desperate attempts by Sterling's remaining loyalists to sow division and doubt, while potent in their initial impact, began to falter against the sheer weight of this unified public outcry. The pardons, intended to cripple the prosecution and protect the guilty, instead served as a stark illustration of the rot that had permeated the administration, further fueling the public's resolve. Each act of defiance from Sterling, each attempt to subvert the democratic process, only seemed to fan the flames of popular resistance. The people, having witnessed the extent of his corruption and his willingness to sacrifice the nation's integrity for personal gain, were no longer willing to be passive spectators. This collective awakening was not a fleeting moment of outrage but a deep-seated commitment to structural change. The movements that emerged were not content with simply removing Sterling, they were determined to build a more resilient and accountable system. They understood that the vulnerabilities exploited by Sterling were not unique to him but were systemic flaws that needed to be addressed with urgency and determination. The fight for justice had transcended the courtroom and the Senate chamber, becoming a fundamental quest to redefine the relationship between the governed and those who governed. The narrative of Sterling's reign had been one of ego, entitlement, and the erosion of democratic norms. But the narrative that was now unfolding, written by the people themselves, was one of awakening, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of a more just and equitable society. It was a testament to the fact that even in the face of profound corruption and the near collapse of institutions, the spirit of democracy, when truly tested, could emerge stronger, more vibrant, and more determined than ever before. The verdict of the people, in its most fundamental sense, was not a judgment on an individual, but a reaffirmation of their own power and their unyielding commitment to the ideals of a free and self-governing nation. The reckoning had begun, not just for Sterling, but for the nation itself, a reckoning that promised a painful but ultimately cathartic path toward renewal. The echoes of their voices, once scattered and unheard, were now a chorus, demanding not just the fall of a corrupt leader, but the rise of a renewed democracy. As the dust settled, the stark reality of Sterling's departure revealed a nation grappling with the true cost of his tenure. The allegiances that had been forged in the fires of his presidency were now laid bare, some tempered and strengthened by the ordeal, others revealed as brittle and self-serving. The swiftness with which certain individuals abandoned ship, their earlier pronouncements of loyalty dissolving like mist in the morning sun, was a stark testament to their opportunistic natures. These were the ones who had navigated the murky waters of Sterling's administration with a keen eye on personal gain, their moral compasses perpetually recalibrated to the shifting winds of power. Their complicity, whether active or passive, in Sterling's abuses now placed them in a precarious position, their reputations tarnished, their futures uncertain. The legal ramifications for many of these figures were still unfolding, but the court of public opinion had already rendered a swift and unforgiving verdict. Their names, once associated with influence and authority, were now whispered with derision, their former positions of power a source of public scorn. The pardons Sterling had so desperately dished out in his final hours, intended as a shield, had instead become a scarlet letter, marking their recipients as complicit in a widespread betrayal of public trust. Conversely, amidst the wreckage of Sterling's failed presidency, a different kind of truth emerged. The quiet bravery of those who had resisted, who had chosen principle over expediency, began to shine with a renewed brilliance. These were the individuals who, despite immense pressure, had stood firm in their convictions. They were the civil servants who had refused to bend to illegal directives, the intelligence officers who had leaked crucial information to expose the truth, the legal minds who had argued for justice even when the tide seemed irrevocably turned against it. Their actions, often undertaken at great personal risk, had been instrumental in the eventual downfall of Sterling and the awakening of the public consciousness. Consider, for instance, the clandestine network of whistleblowers within the very agencies Sterling had sought to control. They had meticulously documented his abuses of power, their efforts spanning months, even years. They had risked their careers, their livelihoods, and in some cases, their very safety to ensure that the truth would surface. Their courage was not born of grand pronouncements or public fanfare, but from a deep-seated belief in the sanctity of the democratic process. They understood that Sterling's actions were not merely political missteps, but a fundamental assault on the institutions that protected the nation. Their quiet defiance, their unwavering commitment to duty and truth, served as a vital counterpoint to the pervasive atmosphere of fear and corruption that Sterling had cultivated. Their contributions, though largely invisible to the public at large, formed the bedrock upon which the entire edifice of accountability was built. Then there were the journalists, the investigative reporters who had been relentlessly targeted by Sterling and his allies. They had faced smear campaigns, legal challenges, and the constant threat of surveillance. Yet, they persevered, their pursuit of truth unyielding. They unearthed the financial entanglements, the backroom deals, the extent of Sterling's corruption, piecing together a narrative that the public could no longer ignore. Their dedication was a vital service, a living embodiment of the First Amendment's promise of a free press. In an era of manufactured consent and manipulated narratives, these journalists served as essential conduits of truth, ensuring that the public remained informed and engaged. Their ability to continue their work despite the immense pressure was a testament to their integrity and their unwavering commitment to their profession's highest ideals. The moral landscape, now starkly illuminated, offered a clear delineation between those who had succumbed to the allure of power and those who had remained anchored by their principles. Sterling's inner circle, those who had actively facilitated his transgressions, were now facing the consequences. Their complicity, once a source of their perceived strength and influence, had become their undoing. They had been willing participants in the erosion of democratic norms. Their silence or active support of Sterling's abuse is a damning indictment of their character. These were the individuals who had traded their integrity for proximity to power, believing that Sterling's reign would be eternal. Their miscalculation had led them to a precipice, from which their fall was now inevitable. This segment of Sterling's former associates included figures who had wielded significant influence within his administration. There was the Secretary of State, who had publicly defended Sterling's most egregious foreign policy decisions, often with fabricated justifications, only to be revealed as having received substantial kickbacks from foreign entities Sterling had favored. His public pronouncements of unwavering loyalty now rang hollow, exposing a deep-seated corruption that had permeated the highest levels of government. His attempts to deflect blame onto subordinates were met with widespread disbelief, his betrayal of the public trust a glaring example of how ambition could corrupt even those in positions of supposed honor. Similarly, the National Security Advisor, once lauded as a brilliant strategist, was found to have systematically suppressed intelligence that contradicted Sterling's narrative, thereby enabling his dangerous policies. This individual had not only failed to act as a check on Sterling's impulses but had actively participated in creating a distorted reality, feeding Sterling the information he wanted to hear, regardless of its veracity. The consequences of this suppression of truth had been dire, leading to miscalculations that had endangered the nation and its allies. Their complicity, therefore, was not merely a matter of political expediency but a direct threat to national security, a betrayal of the oath they had taken to protect and serve. The Chief of Staff, too, found their position untenable. While perhaps not directly involved in the most egregious acts, their role in enabling Sterling's behavior through administrative means, managing his schedule to shield him from scrutiny, and orchestrating his public relations strategies, painted a picture of complicity. They had, in essence, been the architect of Sterling's isolation, creating a bubble of sycophancy that allowed his worst impulses to flourish unchecked. Their actions, though seemingly administrative, had played a crucial role in facilitating the broader pattern of abuse. Their defense, that they were merely following orders, held little water in the face of the overwhelming evidence of their active participation in the machinery of corruption. This stark delineation served as a crucial, albeit painful, lesson for the nation. It highlighted the paramount importance of integrity and courage, especially in times of crisis. The crisis precipitated by Sterling's presidency had, in effect, acted as a moral litmus test for those in positions of power and influence. It revealed who among them possessed the fortitude to stand by their principles, even when faced with overwhelming pressure to conform or compromise. The individuals who had resisted Sterling's descent into authoritarianism, those who had chosen the path of righteousness, were now emerging as beacons of hope. They had not sought the limelight, nor had they acted out of a desire for personal gain. Their motivations were rooted in a profound commitment to the democratic ideals that Sterling had sought to dismantle. Their bravery was not always spectacular. It often manifested in quiet acts of defiance, in dissenting memos, in the refusal to implement unlawful orders, in the unwavering commitment to their sworn duties. These acts, though seemingly small in isolation, collectively formed a formidable bulwark against the encroaching tide of tyranny. One such example was a mid-level attorney in the Department of Justice, who had been tasked with drafting the legal justification for a highly questionable executive order. Faced with the knowledge that the order was legally dubious and ethically reprehensible, this attorney had spent sleepless nights wrestling with their conscience. Ultimately, they had refused to sign off on the document, instead preparing a detailed memo outlining the legal and constitutional objections. This act of quiet rebellion, though initially met with reprimand and threats of dismissal, had eventually found its way to the attention of those conducting the impeachment inquiry, providing crucial legal groundwork for challenging Sterling's authority. Their courage lay not in grand pronouncements, but in a steadfast adherence to the rule of law, even at significant personal cost. Another individual was a seasoned diplomat who had been pressured to engage in a public campaign to discredit international observers critical of Sterling's policies. The diplomat, a respected figure with decades of service, had refused, arguing that such actions would irrevocably damage the nation's standing on the global stage and betray the very principles of open dialogue and transparency that diplomacy was meant to uphold. Their refusal was not a single dramatic stand but a series of consistent, principled objections that, over time, had made it impossible for Sterling's administration to execute its agenda of disinformation. Their unwavering commitment to truth and diplomatic integrity had, in its own way, served as a powerful act of resistance. The contrast between these individuals and those who had faltered was stark. It was a narrative that defined not just the end of Sterling's era, but the very essence of what it meant to be a guardian of democracy. The allure of power, the fear of reprisal, the desire for personal advancement, these were potent forces that had lured many astray. They had chosen the path of least resistance, believing that aligning with the prevailing power structure was the safest and most beneficial course of action. However, the reckoning had demonstrated that such choices, while offering short-term gains, ultimately led to a profound and lasting deficit of character and integrity. The unmasking of allies and enemies, therefore, was not merely a theatrical revelation, it was a fundamental clarification of moral standing. It was a testament to the enduring truth that in times of profound crisis, character is revealed not in words but in deeds. Sterling's presidency had served as a dark mirror, reflecting the best and worst of those who stood in his orbit. The nation, in witnessing this unraveling, was left with a crucial understanding. The strength of a democracy depended not just on its institutions, but on the unwavering integrity and courage of the individuals who inhabited them. Those who had stood for justice, however quietly, had ultimately paved the way for a renewed faith in the democratic process, while those who had aided tyranny, however subtly, had been exposed for the corrosive forces they truly were. This understanding would become the bedrock upon which the nation would begin to rebuild. The verdict was in. The courtroom, which had been the epicenter of the nation's anxieties for weeks, now echoed with a peculiar silence. It wasn't the quiet of emptiness, but the charged stillness that follows a storm, a moment suspended between the fury that has passed and the calm that is yet to fully descend. The pronouncement of Sterling's guilt had been met not with a triumphant roar, but with a collective, shaky exhale that rippled through the assembled press, the legal teams, and the distant viewers watching on screens across the country. A burden had been lifted, yes, but its weight had been so immense, so deeply ingrained, that its absence left a palpable void, a space now filled with the dawning realization of the immense task of recovery. The immediate aftermath was not a celebration, but a sober assessment of the damage. Sterling's presidency had been a prolonged assault on the nation's foundations, its institutions, its norms, and its very sense of shared reality. The economic repercussions alone were a tangled web of policies designed to benefit a select few, leaving behind a trail of instability and widening inequality. Industries had been manipulated, markets distorted, and vital public services starved in service of personal enrichment and ideological rigidity. The scars ran deep, from the small business owner struggling to compete against unfairly favored monopolies to the communities left behind by disinvestment and neglect. This was not just a political crisis, it was an economic one, demanding a meticulous, arduous process of repair. More insidious, perhaps, was the erosion of trust. Sterling had masterfully cultivated an environment where truth was fluid, where facts were negotiable, and where loyalty was paramount, even when it meant overlooking undeniable transgressions. He had pitted citizen against citizen, demonized dissent, and systematically undermined the credibility of institutions designed to hold power accountable. The media, the judiciary, the intelligence agencies, all had been subjected to relentless attacks, leaving a public deeply divided and suspicious. Rebuilding this shattered trust would be a monumental undertaking, requiring not just official pronouncements of reform, but a sustained, visible commitment to transparency and integrity from the very top. It would mean re-establishing faith in the idea that government served the people, not the other way around. Yet, amidst the somber reflection and the daunting prospect of recovery, a powerful current of hope began to surge. The very act of holding Sterling accountable, of seeing justice, however imperfectly, prevail, had rekindled a belief in the resilience of democratic ideals. It was a testament to the fact that even in the face of unprecedented challenges, the collective will of the people, when galvanized, could effect change. The widespread public outcry, the sustained activism, the quiet courage of whistleblowers and principled officials, these were not mere footnotes to Sterling's downfall, they were the very sinews of the nation's revival. They demonstrated that the spirit of democracy, though tested, was far from extinguished. This burgeoning hope was not a naive optimism, but a hard-won, pragmatic optimism. It acknowledged the immense difficulties ahead, the deeply entrenched systems that would need dismantling, and the potential for future attempts to subvert the democratic process. But it was also fueled by a profound understanding of the nation's capacity for renewal. The conversations that had erupted across the country, the renewed engagement in civic life, the demand for greater accountability, these were the seeds of a stronger, more vigilant democracy. People had seen the fragility of their systems, and in that realization, they had discovered their own power. The movements that had sprung up in defiance of Sterling's reign, born from necessity and fueled by a shared sense of purpose, now found themselves at a crossroads. Their energy, once directed towards opposition, now needed to be channeled into construction. Grassroots organizations, citizen watchdog groups, and reform advocates began to pivot, their focus shifting from protest to policy, from resistance to reconstruction. The demands for campaign finance reform, for enhanced transparency, for robust oversight of executive power, once shouted from the streets, were now being meticulously drafted into legislative proposals. They understood that Sterling's abuses were not isolated incidents but symptoms of systemic vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed with urgency and foresight. The fight for justice had evolved into a determined effort to build a more resilient and accountable future. In the heart of the Capitol, Elias Vance found himself at the nexus of this transition. His own journey, from the shadows of intelligence to the forefront of a movement for accountability, had mirrored the nation's awakening. He saw the genuine desire for change in the eyes of the people who now approached him, not with demands for retribution, but with questions about how to safeguard their hard-won progress. He understood that the legal conviction was merely the first step on a long and arduous path. The real work lay in healing the divisions, rebuilding the institutions Sterling had attacked, and fostering a culture of civic responsibility that would serve as an impenetrable bulwark against future attempts to undermine democracy. Vance began to convene meetings, not in hushed government offices, but in community centers, in university halls, in spaces where the voices of ordinary citizens could be heard. He brought together legal scholars, economists, sociologists, and, most importantly, the everyday people who had been most affected by Sterling's presidency. The discussions were often passionate, sometimes fraught with lingering resentment, but always driven by a shared commitment to moving forward. They dissected the failures of the past, not to dwell on blame, but to extract lessons. They analyzed the mechanisms of Sterling's rise to power, seeking to understand how a democracy could become so vulnerable to demagoguery and corruption. One of the most pressing issues on the agenda was the economic recovery. The intricate web of regulations Sterling had manipulated needed to be untangled and rebuilt on a foundation of fairness and sustainability. Experts presented strategies for revitalizing struggling industries, for reining in corporate malfeasance, and for creating an economic system that benefited a broader spectrum of society. The focus was not on punitive measures against those who had profited from Sterling's policies, but on creating an environment where such abuses would be structurally impossible. This involved strengthening antitrust laws, increasing transparency in financial dealings, and investing in education and job training to equip the workforce for the challenges of a new economic era. The goal was not simply to restore the economy to its pre-Sterling state, but to build a more equitable and resilient one. The restoration of trust was another critical pillar. Vance and his allies understood that this could not be achieved through pronouncements alone. It required tangible actions that demonstrated a commitment to accountability and ethical governance. This included implementing stricter ethics rules for public officials, establishing independent oversight bodies with real teeth, and ensuring that the voices of ordinary citizens were integrated into the policymaking process. The idea was to create a government that was not only efficient and effective but also transparent and responsive to the needs of its people. Initiatives aimed at combating disinformation, supporting independent journalism, and promoting media literacy were also seen as vital components of this broader effort to rebuild public trust. The legal and ethical ramifications for those who had facilitated Sterling's actions also occupied a significant portion of the national discourse. While the former president had been convicted, many of his lieutenants, aides, and enablers had escaped direct legal punishment, often due to Sterling's desperate last-minute maneuvers or the complexities of proving individual culpability. However, the court of public opinion had rendered its own verdict. The reputations of these individuals were irrevocably tarnished, their contributions to public service now viewed through the lens of their complicity. Many found themselves ostracized, their careers in public life effectively over. This social consequence, though not a legal one, served as a powerful deterrent, reinforcing the understanding that ethical conduct was not merely a matter of legal compliance but a fundamental requirement for public trust. The conversations also delved into the very fabric of civic education. Sterling's presidency had exposed a worrying gap in the nation's understanding of its own democratic processes and its historical struggles to uphold them. New educational initiatives began to emerge, designed to foster a deeper appreciation for civics, critical thinking, and the importance of active, informed participation. These programs aim to equip future generations with the knowledge and the critical faculties necessary to resist the siren song of authoritarianism and to actively defend democratic norms. The emphasis was on understanding the mechanisms of power, the rights and responsibilities of citizens, and the historical lessons learned from periods of democratic backsliding. As the weeks turned into months, a sense of cautious optimism began to permeate the national consciousness. The immediate crisis of Sterling's presidency had passed, but the process of rebuilding was just beginning. It was a process that would require sustained effort, vigilance, and a renewed commitment to the ideals that had been so severely tested. The nation had looked into the abyss and, in doing so, had rediscovered its own strength and resilience. The journey ahead would be long and undoubtedly challenging, marked by setbacks and renewed debates. Yet, the underlying current of hope, born from collective action and the unwavering pursuit of justice, offered a compelling vision of a nation that, having faced its darkest hour, was determined to emerge stronger, more unified, and more committed than ever to the principles of democracy. The reckoning had been painful, but it was also a profound catalyst for renewal, a stark reminder that the health of a democracy lay not in the pronouncements of its leaders, but in the unwavering engagement and moral courage of its people. The future remained unwritten, but for the first time in a long time, the pen felt firmly in the hands of those who believed in a better tomorrow, a tomorrow built on the enduring power of justice and the indomitable spirit of a nation that refused to surrender its ideals. Chapter 6. The Scars of Power. The heavy steel door clanged shut with a definitive, echoing finality that seemed to seal away not just a man, but an era. Sterling, once the architect of a nation's destiny, now stood in a sterile, concrete cell, the air thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and the unspoken weight of despair. The transition was brutal, a sudden amputation of everything he had known, everything he had commanded. Gone were the polished mahogany desks, the hushed reverence of his advisors, the roar of adoring crowds. In their place, the oppressive silence of confinement, broken only by the rhythmic clang of distant doors, the muffled shouts of guards, and the gnawing echo of his own thoughts. This was not the gilded cage of a political prisoner, rife with intrigue and potential escape. This was the unvarnished reality of a convicted criminal. The opulent penthouse suites and sprawling estates that had once defined his existence were now a cruel memory, a phantom limb that ached with phantom luxury. He remembered the cool silk of bespoke suits, the weight of a Patek Philippe on his wrist, the taste of single malt scotch savored in private lounges. Here, the fabric of his uniform was coarse, utilitarian, designed to strip away individuality. His meals, served on a plastic tray, were bland, functional, a far cry from the elaborate banquets he had hosted. Each day was a relentless, monotonous cycle: wake, eat, march, eat, sleep. The sheer lack of agency was a suffocating blanket, a constant, gnawing reminder of his utter helplessness. He, who had wielded the power of life and death over nations, now waited for permission to use the lavatory. His mind, once a finely tuned instrument of manipulation and strategy, struggled to reconcile the man he was with the prisoner he had become. He would pace the length of his cell, a meager 10 steps by 12, his footsteps a hollow echo in the vast emptiness of his new reality. He'd replay conversations, dissect decisions, searching for the singular moment where it had all gone so catastrophically wrong. Was it the deregulation that had backfired so spectacularly? The inflammatory rhetoric that had finally crossed a line? Or was it something deeper, an inherent flaw in his own design, a hubris so profound it had blinded him to the precipice? The answers, however, remained elusive, lost in the fog of his own self-deception. He craved understanding, not to atone, but to reaffirm his own perceived brilliance, to find a justification for the injustice he felt had been inflicted upon him. The isolation was the most insidious torment. The guards, mere automatons in his eyes, offered no solace, no conversation beyond the perfunctory commands. The other inmates, a spectrum of broken lives and hardened souls, were a world apart, a subculture he neither understood nor wished to engage with. He was an anomaly, a pariah even amongst pariahs. His former allies, those who had basked in his reflected glory, had vanished like smoke. The phone calls that had once buzzed with sycophantic voices were now silent. The letters he had once received, filled with praise and pleas for favor, were replaced by the stark, impersonal communication of official prison notices. He was a ghost in his own life, his presence acknowledged only by the clanking of metal and the grim faces of his wardens. He would spend hours staring at the stained concrete walls, tracing the patterns of dampness, inventing landscapes, entire civilizations, in the minutiae of their imperfections. These were not acts of contemplation, but desperate attempts to escape the suffocating confines of his own skull. The sheer absence of stimulation was a form of torture. There were no flickering screens, no urgent communiques, no geopolitical crises to manage. His intellect, honed for the grand chessboard of global power, was now reduced to deciphering the subtle nuances of a fly's trajectory across the cell. He was a predator trapped in a cage, his instincts dulled, his purpose rendered obsolete. The loss of adoration was a wound that festered, far more painful than any physical discomfort. He had thrived on the collective gaze, on the palpable energy of a crowd hanging on his every word. He had mistaken their applause for genuine admiration, their cheers for unwavering loyalty. Now, the silence was deafening, a constant reminder of his fall from grace. He would sometimes catch his reflection in the polished steel of his water cup, a gaunt, haunted face staring back, the lines of stress and sleepless nights etched deep. The imperious stare was gone, replaced by a flicker of something akin to fear, and beneath that, a chilling emptiness. He was no longer Sterling, the Titan, the savior, the man who could bend the world to his will. He was merely inmate number 734, a number devoid of history, of ambition, of any claim to significance. He struggled to grasp the permanence of his situation. His mind, accustomed to negotiating, to finding loopholes, to bending rules, still sought an exit strategy. He would mentally review the legal proceedings, dissecting the prosecution's case, searching for an overlooked detail, a misplaced comma, a judicial error that could be exploited. But the verdict was absolute, the evidence overwhelming. The wheels of justice, once seemingly sluggish and easily swayed by his influence, had ground on with an inexorable force. He was not just imprisoned, he was convicted, his transgressions laid bare for the world to see. The psychological toll was immense. His carefully constructed persona, that of an unshakable leader, began to crumble. Moments of uncharacteristic vulnerability would surface, fleeting glimpses of the man beneath the veneer of power. He'd find himself staring out the small, barred window, a sliver of sky offering a tantalizing, mocking glimpse of the world outside, a world that continued to spin without his direction. He, who had once dictated the global economic agenda, now found himself agonizing over the exact number of minutes until his next meager meal. The indignity was not in the lack of comfort, but in the profound irrelevance. He began to withdraw, his already limited interactions dwindling to monosyllabic grunts. He found solace, paradoxically, in the very monotony that was slowly eroding his sanity. The routine became a shield, a predictable rhythm that allowed him to avoid confronting the gaping chasm where his former life had been. He would meticulously fold and refold his uniform, arrange and rearrange the meager possessions allowed in his cell, finding a semblance of order in a world that had been violently overturned. These were not the actions of a man plotting an escape, but of a soul desperately seeking an anchor in a sea of existential dread. He would dream, vivid, technicolor dreams of his past triumphs, of the roar of the crowd, of the power coursing through him. He would wake with a start, the phantom echo of applause still ringing in his ears, only to be met by the stark, unforgiving reality of his cell. The transition was jarring, a cruel jolt that left him disoriented and disconsolate. He began to understand that Sterling, the president, the icon, the legend, was dead. What remained was a broken man, stripped of his power, his influence, and his very identity. The chains that bound him were not made of iron, but of regret, of isolation, and of the crushing weight of a fallen empire, his own. The true imprisonment, he was beginning to realize, was not the concrete walls, but the boundless, desolate expanse of his own shattered psyche. The silence outside his cell was deafening, but the silence within him was a deafening roar, a testament to the profound and irreversible loss of everything he had ever believed defined him. He was a king dethroned, a god fallen from grace, left to contemplate the ruins of his ambition in the suffocating solitude of his new, eternal kingdom. His power had not been stolen, it had evaporated, leaving behind only the phantom sensation of its presence, a constant, agonizing reminder of what he had been, and what he would never be again. The scars of power were not visible on his skin, but etched into the very fabric of his being, a permanent testament to the destructive trajectory of unchecked ambition. The echoes of Sterling's reign had been an earthquake, shattering the foundations of the nation. Now, in the unsettling quiet that followed, the true work began, the painstaking, arduous task of rebuilding, brick by fractured brick. The initial days were a blur of urgent pronouncements and cautious optimism. A new interim government, a coalition of seasoned politicians, technocrats, and civic leaders, had been hastily assembled. Their mandate was clear, their resolve palpable, to steer the nation away from the abyss and towards a future unburdened by the shadows of corruption. But the weight of Sterling's legacy was immense, a palpable presence that loomed over every decision, every whispered conversation in the halls of power. The economic fallout was cataclysmic. The vast sums siphoned off by Sterling and his cronies had left gaping holes in national budgets. Infrastructure projects, once heralded as beacons of progress, now lay half-finished, skeletal monuments to greed and negligence. Industries that had relied on fair competition had withered under the weight of monopolies and rigged contracts. Unemployment soared, and with it, the pervasive sense of despair that had settled over the populace like a shroud. The new leadership understood that mere pronouncements of reform would not suffice. Trust, once shattered, was a fragile commodity, easily lost and incredibly difficult to regain. The first order of business was a comprehensive audit, a deep dive into the labyrinthine financial networks Sterling had so artfully constructed. This was no simple accounting exercise, it was an archaeological dig into the very soul of the nation's economic malaise. Investigators, armed with forensic accounting software and an unwavering commitment to truth, began the arduous process of unraveling the complex web of offshore accounts, shell corporations, and illicit transactions. Every ledger, every bank statement, every whispered offshore deal was meticulously scrutinized. The sheer scale of the embezzlement was staggering, a testament to the insatiable appetite of those who had once occupied the highest echelons of power. It revealed not just financial malfeasance, but a systemic rot that had permeated every level of government, from the smallest municipal office to the grandest ministries. Simultaneously, a series of legislative reforms were swiftly enacted. Laws that had been manipulated to serve the interests of a select few were repealed and replaced with legislation designed to foster transparency and accountability. New oversight committees were established, empowered to monitor government spending, scrutinize public contracts, and investigate allegations of corruption without fear of reprisal. Whistleblower protection laws were strengthened, encouraging citizens to come forward with information without the paralyzing fear of retaliation. The aim was to create a robust framework that would not only prevent future corruption but also provide mechanisms for swift and decisive action when transgressions occurred. But the human element of recovery was equally, if not more, critical. The deep wounds of betrayal and disillusionment would not be healed by legislation alone. The new government launched a series of public engagement initiatives, seeking to reconnect with the citizenry and foster a renewed sense of shared purpose. Town hall meetings, broadcast live across the nation, became forums for open dialogue, where citizens could voice their concerns, ask direct questions of their leaders, and feel heard. Public service campaigns, featuring ordinary citizens recounting their experiences and expressing their hopes for the future, aimed to remind the populace of the resilience and inherent goodness of their nation. The media, once muzzled and manipulated, now played a crucial role in this process of reconstruction. Investigative journalists, freed from the shackles of censorship, delved into the lingering effects of Sterling's reign, exposing hidden networks of corruption that still sought to undermine the new order. They meticulously documented the economic hardship faced by ordinary families, amplifying their voices and holding the government accountable for its promises. The news cycle was a constant barrage of both grim realities and hopeful progress, a reflection of the complex and often messy nature of national recovery. One of the most challenging aspects was the psychological recovery of the nation. Decades of authoritarianism and corruption had fostered a deep-seated cynicism, a pervasive belief that power would always corrupt and that justice was an elusive ideal. Rebuilding faith in democratic institutions required more than just free and fair elections. It demanded a demonstrable commitment to ethical conduct, a consistent adherence to the rule of law, and a palpable sense of justice being served. The trials of Sterling's key lieutenants, though often protracted and complex, served as vital milestones in this process. Each conviction, each forfeiture of ill-gotten gains, chipped away at the edifice of impunity that Sterling had so carefully constructed. The economic reconstruction was a monumental undertaking. Foreign aid, cautiously offered by international partners, began to flow in, but it was not a panacea. The government focused on diversifying the economy, investing in education and technological innovation, and creating an environment conducive to both domestic and foreign investment. Policies were implemented to support small and medium-sized enterprises, the backbone of any healthy economy, encouraging entrepreneurship and job creation. The aim was to build a sustainable economic future, one that was not reliant on the whims of corrupt leaders or the exploitation of natural resources. The lingering scars of Sterling's rule were not always visible. They manifested in the distrust between citizens and institutions, in the deep-seated anxieties about the future, and in the subtle ways that old networks of influence continued to resist change. Vigilance, therefore, became the watchword. The fight for justice was not confined to the courtroom or the halls of government. It was a daily, collective effort. It required citizens to remain engaged, to hold their leaders accountable, and to actively participate in the democratic process. It demanded a constant awareness of the potential for regression, a commitment to learning from the past, and an unwavering belief in the possibility of a better future. The education system, a casualty of Sterling's neglect, underwent a radical overhaul. Curricula were revised to include civics education, critical thinking, and ethical development. Universities were granted greater autonomy, fostering an environment of intellectual freedom and research. The goal was to cultivate a new generation of citizens, informed, engaged, and equipped to safeguard the democratic gains that had been so hard-won. The long road to recovery was not just about rebuilding infrastructure and economies, it was about rebuilding the very fabric of society, instilling a renewed sense of national pride and a commitment to shared values. The international community watched with bated breath. Sterling's fall had been a global spectacle, a stark reminder of the fragility of democracy and the pervasive threat of authoritarianism. The success of this nation's recovery would send a powerful message to the world, a testament to the enduring power of the people to reclaim their destiny. This was not a race with a clear finish line, but a marathon, demanding sustained effort, unwavering commitment, and a profound understanding that the scars of power, though painful, could also serve as a constant reminder of the vigilance required to prevent their recurrence. The new leadership understood that their primary responsibility was not just to govern, but to actively cultivate a culture of integrity, resilience, and hope, ensuring that the darkness of Sterling's era would forever remain a cautionary tale, not a recurring nightmare. The journey was fraught with peril, but the spirit of the nation, battered but not broken, was beginning to stir, fueled by the quiet determination of millions to forge a future worthy of their sacrifices. The weight of the past was heavy, but the promise of a just and prosperous future, however distant, offered a beacon of hope that illuminated the arduous path ahead. The transformation was not a sudden, dramatic event, but a slow, organic process, like the gradual emergence of new growth from scorched earth. Each small victory, a successful corruption prosecution, a revitalized local business, a community project that brought people together, was a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and the collective will to heal. The true measure of Sterling's fall, and the nascent government's legitimacy, lay not merely in the dismantling of his oppressive apparatus or the recovery of pilfered fortunes. It resided in the quiet, often agonizing, process of addressing the deep, festering wounds inflicted upon individuals and entire communities. While the grand pronouncements of reform and the meticulous audits of national coffers commanded headlines, the true reconstruction, the arduous path to societal healing, unfolded in a myriad of smaller, more personal battles for justice. This was the domain of restorative justice, a concept that had been brutally suppressed under Sterling's iron fist, and its re-emergence was a delicate, yet vital, undertaking. The victims of Sterling's financial machinations, those who had been systematically defrauded and impoverished, were not abstract statistics in a forensic accounting report. They were families whose life savings had vanished, small business owners driven to ruin by predatory monopolies, and ordinary citizens whose pensions had been systematically plundered. For years, their pleas had fallen on deaf ears, their suffering dismissed as collateral damage in the pursuit of Sterling's megalomaniacal vision. Now, the new administration grappled with the immense challenge of providing not just financial restitution, but also a genuine acknowledgement of their pain. This was an undertaking fraught with complexity. The sheer volume of fraudulent transactions, spread across a labyrinthine network of offshore accounts and shell corporations, meant that tracing every stolen cent was a Herculean task. Moreover, the stolen assets were often so deeply buried, so effectively laundered, that their recovery seemed an almost insurmountable challenge. Yet, the commitment was unwavering. Special task forces, comprised of forensic accountants, legal experts, and international investigators, were established. Their mandate was not just to recover the money, but to do so with a speed and transparency that would begin to rebuild public trust. Each recovered dollar, each finalized restitution order, became a small, hard-won victory against the pervasive cynicism that Sterling's reign had cultivated. Beyond the direct financial victims, there were those whose lives had been irrevocably altered by Sterling's draconian policies and his systematic suppression of dissent. Communities had been devastated by the environmental degradation caused by his cronies' unchecked industrial exploitation. Families had been torn apart by his politically motivated purges, where individuals who dared to speak out had been imprisoned, disappeared, or worse. Acknowledging this suffering required more than just official apologies. It necessitated a concerted effort to understand the lived experiences of these individuals and communities. Public forums were organized, allowing victims to share their stories in a safe and supportive environment. These were not always televised spectacles. Often, they were intimate gatherings in town halls, community centers, or even private homes, where the raw pain of decades of oppression could be voiced without fear of reprisal. Survivors of arbitrary detention, families of the disappeared, and those who had witnessed the systematic erosion of their basic human rights were given platforms to speak, and more importantly, to be heard. The government committed to establishing truth commissions, not to reignite old grievances, but to create an official historical record that acknowledged the suffering and provided a foundation for reconciliation. These commissions were tasked with meticulously documenting the abuses, identifying perpetrators, and recommending measures to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. The process was cathartic for some, re-traumatizing for others, but it was an essential step in confronting the collective trauma that Sterling's regime had inflicted. The question of accountability extended beyond the immediate perpetrators of financial fraud or human rights abuses. It also encompassed those who, through their silence, their complicity, or their active participation, had enabled Sterling's reign of terror. The legal framework for prosecuting such individuals was already being bolstered by the new legislative reforms, but the challenge lay in navigating the intricate webs of influence and power that Sterling had so skillfully woven. Many of his lieutenants, men and women who had occupied positions of authority and had profited from his corrupt system, sought to fade into the background, hoping that the passage of time and the focus on larger issues would allow them to escape scrutiny. However, the new government understood that selective accountability would not suffice. A comprehensive approach was needed, one that pursued justice for all levels of complicity. This involved not only criminal prosecutions but also civil forfeiture of assets acquired through illicit means. Those who had benefited from Sterling's corruption, even if they had not directly perpetrated the most egregious crimes, were subject to rigorous investigation. Their ill-gotten gains, accumulated through rigged contracts, preferential treatment, or the suppression of competitors, were targeted for recovery. This was a crucial aspect of restorative justice, as it aimed to return wealth to the state and, by extension, to the people from whom it had been unjustly taken. The legal battles were often protracted and complex, involving intricate financial forensics and lengthy court proceedings. But each successful forfeiture, each conviction, sent a clear message that impunity was no longer an option. The concept of restorative justice also extended to the broader societal impact of Sterling's rule. His regime had fostered a climate of fear, distrust, and cynicism. Generations had grown up believing that the system was rigged, that justice was a privilege reserved for the powerful, and that individual agency was a futile illusion. Rebuilding this fractured social contract required more than just legal pronouncements. It demanded a conscious effort to reinstill faith in the institutions of democracy and in the inherent goodness of fellow citizens. The government actively supported initiatives aimed at fostering civic engagement and community rebuilding. Programs were launched to encourage dialogue and reconciliation within communities that had been divided by political loyalties or economic disparities. These initiatives often involved local leaders, religious figures, and community organizers working together to heal old wounds and build bridges. The media played a vital role in this process, not just by exposing corruption, but also by highlighting stories of resilience, courage, and collective action. By showcasing examples of individuals and communities working together to overcome adversity, the media helped to cultivate a narrative of hope and collective agency, counteracting the pervasive narrative of despair that Sterling had so effectively propagated. Furthermore, the government recognized that true justice required honoring the sacrifices of those who had actively fought against Sterling's regime. These were the whistleblowers, the journalists, the activists, and the ordinary citizens who had risked everything to expose the truth and demand accountability. Many of these individuals had paid a heavy price, facing imprisonment, exile, or the loss of their livelihoods. The new administration made it a priority to support these individuals and their families. Whistleblower protection laws were not only strengthened but actively enforced, ensuring that those who came forward with critical information were shielded from retaliation. Financial assistance and reintegration programs were established for those who had suffered economic hardship due to their activism. Memorials were commissioned to commemorate the lives and struggles of those who had made the ultimate sacrifice, ensuring that their courage would not be forgotten. This act of remembrance was not merely symbolic, it was a tangible demonstration that their sacrifices had not been in vain, that their fight for a just and equitable society had ultimately triumphed. The process of healing was, and would continue to be, a long and arduous one. The scars left by Sterling's brutal regime were deep and complex, touching every facet of national life. Restoring justice meant more than just punishing the guilty, it meant acknowledging the suffering of the victims, rebuilding trust in institutions, and fostering a society where such abuses of power could never again take root. It was a delicate balancing act, requiring both firm resolve in pursuing accountability and profound empathy in addressing the human cost of decades of corruption and oppression. The government's commitment to restorative justice was a testament to this understanding. It was a recognition that true recovery demanded not just the dismantling of an authoritarian system, but the meticulous and compassionate reconstruction of the social fabric that had been so brutally torn apart. Each act of restitution, each public acknowledgement of suffering, each successful prosecution, was a brick laid in the foundation of a new era, an era defined not by the shadow of a dictator, but by the enduring light of justice and the resilience of the human spirit. The journey was far from over, but in the quiet pursuit of justice for every victim, the nation was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to heal. The weight of the past remained, a somber reminder of the price of unchecked power, but the commitment to building a future where such a past would be unthinkable, served as a powerful catalyst for sustained effort and unwavering hope. The collective determination to ensure that every individual's suffering was recognized and addressed, fueled a profound sense of national purpose, binding people together in a shared endeavor to reclaim their dignity and rebuild their lives. This was not merely about retribution, it was about redemption, for the nation as a whole, and for each soul that had been so deeply wounded. The clanging of Sterling's prison cell door was a definitive punctuation mark, a final, resounding clang that echoed through the hushed halls of justice. The man who had held the nation in his iron grip, whose pronouncements had dictated life and death, was now a number, a shadow confined within sterile walls. The jubilation that rippled through the populace was palpable, a collective exhale of relief that had been held for far too long. Statues of Sterling, once revered symbols of an era, were being systematically dismantled, their granite faces chipped away piece by piece, mirroring the erosion of his power. Yet, even as the triumphant narrative of his downfall took hold, a subtler, more insidious truth began to surface. The architects of his regime, the sycophants and the opportunists who had thrived in the toxic ecosystem he cultivated, were not disappearing into the ether. They were merely repositioning themselves, their eyes, like scavengers, scanning the horizon for new opportunities to exploit the shifting sands of power. The very ideology that had fueled Sterling's rise, a potent blend of nationalism, paranoia, and the seductive promise of order through authoritarianism, had not been so easily extinguished. It had burrowed deep into the consciousness of a segment of the population, a comforting balm to those who felt adrift in a complex world, a seductive whisper promising simple solutions to intricate problems. These were the echoes of corruption, not just of stolen funds or rigged contracts, but of a corruption of thought, a willing surrender of critical faculties in exchange for the illusion of strength. The former allies, the shadowy figures who had operated in the periphery of Sterling's inner circle, were not idle. They were the architects of the lingering influence, the quiet engineers of dissent who understood that physical imprisonment did not equate to ideological defeat. Their strategy was not one of overt rebellion, but of subtle subversion, of planting seeds of doubt and misinformation in the fertile ground of public anxiety. Within the labyrinthine corridors of the still-forming government, whispers began to circulate. Disagreements, once suppressed by Sterling's absolute authority, now bloomed into open debate, sometimes acrimonious. This was a necessary process, a sign of a healthy, albeit fledgling, democracy, but it also created fissures that those loyal to Sterling's vision were eager to exploit. They subtly fanned the flames of these internal disputes, portraying the new leadership as weak, divided, and incapable of delivering on their promises. They amplified the voices of dissent, not out of genuine concern for the issues, but as a strategic maneuver to destabilize the nascent government and create an opening for their own return to prominence. The media, still finding its footing in this new era of freedom, often fell prey to these manufactured narratives, inadvertently giving platforms to those who sought to undermine the very freedoms they now claim to champion. A carefully curated news cycle, highlighting every setback, every disagreement, every perceived failure of the new administration, began to paint a picture of chaos, a stark contrast to the supposed order of Sterling's reign. Consider the case of Minister Aris Thorne, a man who had been a close confidant of Sterling, a key architect of his economic policies that had systematically enriched a select few at the expense of the many. Thorne, having escaped immediate prosecution due to his meticulous legal maneuvering and the sheer complexity of the financial webs he had woven, had not vanished. Instead, he had strategically positioned himself as a vocal critic of the new government's economic reforms. His pronouncements, delivered with the polished veneer of concern for the nation's financial stability, were, in reality, a thinly veiled attempt to sow discord and discredit the very institutions that were working to undo Sterling's damage. He would appear on television, lamenting the disruption caused by asset recovery efforts, arguing that such actions were scaring away vital investment. He spoke of the uncertainty plaguing the markets, a narrative that conveniently overlooked the fact that this uncertainty was a direct consequence of Sterling's own corrupt practices. His rhetoric, designed to appeal to a sense of economic pragmatism, resonated with business leaders who had benefited from Sterling's cronyism and with citizens who, exhausted by years of instability, longed for a return to a perceived normalcy, even if that normalcy had been built on a foundation of lies. Thorne's campaign was not about genuine economic recovery, it was about preserving the remnants of Sterling's power structure by framing any attempt to dismantle it as inherently destructive. Then there were the ideological purists, a fringe group who viewed Sterling not as a tyrant, but as a visionary whose true potential had been curtailed by external forces and internal dissent. They operated in the shadows, their influence amplified through encrypted online forums and clandestine meetings. They circulated manifestos, carefully reinterpreting history to portray Sterling as a martyr, a leader who had been unfairly persecuted for attempting to restore national pride and sovereignty. These groups would often latch onto legitimate grievances, hijacking public discontent over, say, the slow pace of reconstruction in a war-torn region, and twisting it into an indictment of the current government's weakness and inability to act decisively. They would contrast this perceived inaction with carefully fabricated tales of Sterling's swift and effective leadership, ignoring the brutal methods that underpinned those actions. The narrative they peddled was one of a betrayed ideal, a promise of greatness unfulfilled, and a call for a return to the strong hand that had once guided the nation. This was a dangerous echo, one that tapped into a deep-seated yearning for certainty and control in an uncertain world. The fragile nature of democratic gains was also underscored by the subtle, yet persistent, attempts to undermine the judiciary. Sterling's regime had systematically eroded judicial independence, stacking courts with loyalists and intimidating judges who dared to dissent. While the new government was working to restore the integrity of the legal system, the lingering effects of that subjugation were profound. Lawyers who had been complicit in defending Sterling's cronies, now seeking to rehabilitate their careers, began to lobby for leniency, arguing for national reconciliation over vindictive prosecution. They would selectively highlight cases where the new government faced legal challenges, framing any judicial setback as evidence of the system's inherent flaws, rather than as a necessary part of a robust legal process. This was a direct assault on the rule of law, an attempt to weaken the very foundations of justice by fostering cynicism about its fairness and impartiality. The public, conditioned by years of witnessing justice being dispensed arbitrarily, was susceptible to these doubts. The message being subtly propagated was that the legal system, even under new leadership, was still susceptible to manipulation, and that true justice was an elusive ideal. The resurgence of Sterling's influence was not about a single, organized movement, but rather a confluence of opportunistic individuals and disillusioned groups, each playing their part in a larger, albeit often uncoordinated, effort to destabilize the new order. They understood that direct confrontation was unlikely to succeed. Instead, they employed a strategy of attrition, of chipping away at public confidence, sowing seeds of doubt, and exploiting every available weakness. Their goal was not necessarily to install a new Sterling, but to create a climate of chaos and instability that would pave the way for a return to a system that prioritized order and control above all else, a system where their own power and influence could once again flourish. The narrative of Sterling's unadulterated downfall, while emotionally satisfying, was a simplification of a far more complex and ongoing struggle. The fight against tyranny was not a single battle, but a continuous war of attrition, fought not just on the grand stages of politics and finance, but in the quiet corners of public discourse, in the subtle manipulation of information, and in the enduring echoes of a corrupted ideology. The lessons learned were invaluable, but their reinforcement was paramount. Without constant vigilance, without a conscious and collective effort to understand the insidious ways in which power can corrupt and how easily freedom can be eroded, history, in its most tragic form, was always at risk of repeating itself. The scars left by Sterling were a stark reminder of the price of complacency, and the ongoing efforts to heal them were a testament to the enduring, yet fragile, promise of a just society. The shadows of Sterling's reign, though diminished, still stretched, a subtle, persistent warning that the work of safeguarding democracy was never truly finished. It required a constant, unwavering commitment to truth, a fierce defense of institutions, and an unyielding skepticism towards those who promised easy answers and demanded unquestioning obedience. The triumph over Sterling was a significant victory, but the true test lay in the sustained effort to prevent his echoes from becoming a roar once more. The final clang of Sterling's cell door, a sound that had once been drowned out by the cheers of a liberated populace, now served as a quiet prelude to a broader, more enduring reflection. The immediate euphoria of Sterling's downfall, the visceral satisfaction of seeing a tyrant caged, was a powerful, necessary catharsis. But as the dust settled, and the nation began the arduous task of rebuilding, the deeper, more profound implications of his reign began to crystallize. This was not merely the story of one man's ambition and ultimate failure, it was a potent, albeit harrowing, parable for all time, a stark illustration of the corrosive nature of unchecked power and the insidious creep of moral decay. The narrative woven through these pages, charting Sterling's ascent, his reign of terror, and his eventual, ignominious fall, was intended as more than just a historical account. It was designed to be a living document, a perpetual warning, a cautionary tale for the future. The lessons etched into the fabric of this story were not intended to be relegated to the archives of history, easily forgotten once the immediate threat had passed. Instead, they were meant to be a constant, vigilant presence in the collective consciousness of every generation that followed. The ease with which Sterling had amassed power, the almost frightening alacrity with which a populace, desperate for order and seduced by the siren song of decisive leadership, had surrendered its freedoms, was a chilling testament to the fragility of democratic ideals. It highlighted, with brutal clarity, the perennial need for an informed citizenry, an electorate that could discern truth from propaganda, that understood the subtle nuances of political maneuvering, and that possessed the critical faculties to question the pronouncements of those in authority, was the first and most vital bulwark against the resurgence of tyranny. Sterling's rise was facilitated, in no small part, by a public weary of complexity, yearning for simplistic answers, and willing to believe the convenient lies that masked inconvenient truths. This narrative was a stark reminder that complacency, coupled with ignorance, was the fertile ground upon which autocracy thrived. The seeds of Sterling's power were sown in the fertile soil of apathy, and they sprouted into a suffocating forest of oppression. Furthermore, the story of Sterling's regime underscored the indispensable role of strong institutions. Sterling had systematically dismantled and corrupted the very pillars of governance that were designed to check his power: the judiciary, the legislature, the free press. He had weaponized the legal system, co-opted legislative bodies, and bent the media to his will, transforming them from guardians of accountability into instruments of his propaganda. The narrative illustrated how these institutions, when hollowed out and subservient, became not safeguards of liberty, but conduits for authoritarian control. The arduous process of rebuilding these institutions, of restoring their integrity and independence, was a testament to their fundamental importance. However, the story also served as a potent reminder that the strength of these institutions was not solely dependent on their structural frameworks, but on the individuals who comprise them, and the courage they exhibited in upholding their oaths and responsibilities, even in the face of immense pressure. A judiciary that bowed to political expediency, a legislature that surrendered its oversight, or a press that prioritized sycophancy over truth, ultimately served only to empower the very forces it was meant to restrain. The resurrection of these structures was not an end in itself, but the beginning of a continuous effort to ensure they remained robust, impartial, and resolutely dedicated to the public good. Central to the entire saga was the concept of unwavering ethical leadership. Stirling, in his pursuit of absolute power, had trampled upon every ethical tenet, embracing deceit, cruelty, and corruption as mere tools of statecraft. His reign was a stark demonstration of how a leader's moral compass, or lack thereof, could shape the destiny of an entire nation. The narrative served as a potent counterpoint to Stirling's perfidy, highlighting the immense value of leaders who prioritized integrity, compassion, and the welfare of their people above personal gain or the consolidation of power. It was a call for a different kind of leadership, one that did not inspire through fear or manipulation, but through genuine service, demonstrable integrity, and a deep-seated commitment to the principles of justice and equality. The rebuilding process was not merely about repairing infrastructure or reforming economic policies. It was about fostering a culture of ethical governance, where transparency was the norm, accountability was non-negotiable, and the pursuit of public service was imbued with a profound sense of moral responsibility. The story of Stirling was a dark mirror, reflecting the devastating consequences of leadership divorced from morality, and a beacon, illuminating the enduring power of virtuous leadership. The concluding chapters of this narrative were not meant to offer a sense of finality, but rather a renewed impetus for ongoing engagement. Stirling's imprisonment was a victory, but the ideological currents that had propelled him to power, the deep-seated anxieties and resentments he had so skillfully exploited, had not simply evaporated. They lay dormant, a potential tinderbox awaiting a spark. Therefore, the ultimate message was one of vigilance. It was a plea to the generations that would inherit the hard-won freedoms and the fragile democracy to remain perpetually watchful. Vigilance meant actively participating in the democratic process, not just during elections, but in the everyday discourse, in holding elected officials accountable, and in challenging narratives that sought to erode civil liberties or promote division. It meant recognizing that the fight for freedom was not a singular event, but a continuous struggle, requiring constant effort and unwavering commitment. The echoes of Stirling's rhetoric, the subtle whispers of authoritarianism that might resurface in different guises, had to be recognized and actively countered. The story was a profound reminder that questioning authority was not an act of subversion, but a cornerstone of a healthy democracy. Stirling had thrived in an environment where dissent was silenced, and critical inquiry was branded as treason. The narrative thus implored future citizens to embrace skepticism, to demand evidence, and to never accept pronouncements at face value. It was a call to actively engage with complex issues, to resist the allure of simplistic solutions offered by charismatic strongmen, and to understand that true progress was often incremental and challenging, rather than instantaneous and effortless. This critical spirit, nurtured and protected, was the essential antidote to the manipulation and deceit that had characterized Stirling's era. To question was to engage was to understand, and to understand was to safeguard. Finally, the narrative was intended as a powerful call to action, urging readers to become active custodians of the values that Stirling had so ruthlessly undermined. It was an exhortation to actively participate in safeguarding democratic values. This participation extended beyond the ballot box. It meant fostering a culture of respect for human rights, promoting inclusivity and tolerance, defending the integrity of the press, and supporting the institutions that upheld the rule of law. It meant recognizing that democracy was not a spectator sport, but a collective endeavor that required the active engagement of every citizen. The cautionary tale of President Stirling was presented not as a historical footnote, but as a living blueprint for what could happen when vigilance faltered, when institutions weakened, and when the ethical compass of leadership was abandoned. It was a catalyst, intended to inspire a resolute commitment to integrity, a steadfast defense of liberty, and an enduring pursuit of a society where power was always held in trust, never wielded as a weapon, and where the scars of the past served as a perpetual reminder of the profound responsibility to build a better, more just, and more resilient future. The story of Stirling was a testament to the fact that the fight for a just society was never truly over. It was a perpetual inheritance, passed down through generations, demanding courage, wisdom, and an unyielding dedication to the principles of freedom and human dignity. Back matter. The creation of this chronicle, detailing the rise and fall of Sterling and the societal tremors that followed, would not have been possible without the unwavering support and invaluable contributions of many individuals. I extend my deepest gratitude to the historians and archivists whose meticulous work preserved the fragmented records of Sterling's reign, providing the raw material for this narrative. Special thanks are due to Dr. Anya Sharma, whose groundbreaking research on societal compliance under authoritarian regimes offered crucial insights into the psychological underpinnings of Sterling's ascent. My editor, Mr. David Chen, deserves commendation for his keen eye and incisive feedback, which sharpened the narrative and ensured its clarity. I am also profoundly grateful to my family, whose patience and understanding sustained me through the demanding process of bringing this story to light. Heartfelt message from author. I write books because I love telling the stories about the ones who are lost, forgotten, and shamed in society. I never forget about the broken and weak. This world has so much evil and pain that's unbearable at times. Take care of each other and show human kindness. Michael A. Neal, Jr. Autarky, a policy of self-sufficiency, often pursued by authoritarian regimes to isolate themselves from international influence and control all economic resources. Democracy fatigue, a state of public disinterest or disillusionment with democratic processes, often stemming from perceived inefficiency, corruption, or a longing for decisive, albeit authoritarian, leadership. Echo chamber, an environment where individuals are exposed only to information and opinions that conform to their existing beliefs, often fostered by selective media consumption and online algorithms, hindering critical thought and reinforcing partisan divides. Plausible deniability, the ability of a leader or organization to deny knowledge of or responsibility for actions taken by subordinates, often through carefully managed information flows and indirect commands. Regime change, the process by which a new government or political system replaces an existing one, whether through peaceful transition, revolution, or external intervention. The Sterling Years, a critical retrospective. Journal of Political History, Volume 42, Issue 3, 20XX. Sharma, Anya, The Architects of Apathy, How Societies Embrace Tyranny. University Press, 20XX. Declassified Documents. The Sterling Archives. National Archives, Accession Number 20XX1138. Interview with former Senator Eleanor Vance. The Chronicle, October 15, 20XX. Analysis of Economic Data, Post-Sterling Reconstruction Era. Global Economic Forum Report, 20XX. A dedicated investigator of historical narratives and societal dynamics, Michael Neal has spent years delving into the complexities of power, governance, and the human condition. With a background in investigative journalism and a passion for unearthing overlooked truths, Michael Neal brings a unique perspective to the realm of historical fiction. This work represents a culmination of extensive research and a deep commitment to exploring the enduring lessons that emerge from the study of both triumph and tragedy. Michael Neal resides in San Pablo, California and is currently working on a new project examining the long-term impacts of ideological polarization.